Next, winter, the Gilded Age. The Civil War made a few businessmen very rich. The North and the South both gave army deferments to the wealthy. The Confederacy exempted owners of more than 50 slaves. The Union let those who had it buy their way out for $300. Among those who paid their $300 was J. Pierpont Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, James Mellon, Philip Armour, and Jay Gould. Mellon just listened to his father, who told him in a letter that, quote, "A man may be a patriot without risking his life or sacrificing his health. There are plenty of lives less valuable," close quote. Those whose lives were, quote, "more valuable," close quote, made fortunes selling guns, ammo, uniforms, food, boats, rail and telegraph services, medical supplies, and more to both sides. War was, as always, a racket. Together, the barons forged the modern corporate state. It was a mighty vampire engine, perfectly designed to suck the life out of the whole human race and the planet on which it depends. With just one genetic and legal imperative, quote, to make money, unquote, the corporation knows no moral constraint or biological need. Today, it still claims human rights, corporate personhood, but no human responsibilities. The corporation has morphed into history's zombie reaper of mass extinction, towering over even church and state, finding what, if anything, can transcend the parasitic power of the modern imperial corporation, may be humankind's ultimate test. The word corporation, like the name of Jesus, does not appear in the Constitution. Richard Grossman says there were 6 corporations here in 1776. The power to go bankrupt, the cornerstone of our modern-day lemon socialism, still shields wealthy owners who go broke or get sued by angry victims. They deflect the costs of incompetence, fraud, and theft from the perpetrators to the public, puking up a super-rich class of uncaring oligarchs now at the brink of dooming us all. America's early corporations were chartered by the states. They were limited in what they could do and where they could do it. Social responsibilities were assumed. Adam Smith's 1776 Wealth of Nations warned that if they got too big, corporate monopolies would shred markets and trash the general welfare. The Gilded Age proved him a prophet. Through the post-bellum era, states like New Jersey and Delaware spewed corporate charters that let new industrial behemoths do any kind of business anywhere they wanted to do it. For the alleged free market, it was a carefully concealed death sentence. The tombstone was chiseled with the Supreme Court's 1886 Santa Clara Railway case. Court Clerk Bancroft Davis, a former railroad president, dubiously memorialized that the justices deemed corporations to be persons under the 14th Amendment. Though the Supremes may actually have said no such thing, corporations were soon granted human rights. The virus festered through Buckley, 1976, and Bellotti, 1978. Citizens United, 2010, and McCutcheon, 2012, enshrined the corporations as America's true supreme being, endowed with the inalienable right to buy any election, commit any crime, and destroy any ecosystem in pursuit of power, privilege, and profit. The stage was set by our first big factories, which made textiles. In Lawrence and Lowell, countless bobbins spun slave-raised cotton into global gold. The women who ran them mostly came from farms, lived in dormitories, and, like Rosie the Riveter, loved their freedom. But after Appomattox, America's Industrial Revolution hit critical mass. Shop floors morphed into hellholes. Owners became monsters and mobsters. From 1848 to 1921, a human tsunami poured in from Ireland and Germany, then from Greece and Italy, Poland and Russia, and, until outlawed, from China and Japan. Andrew Carnegie crowed that the value in human capital based on 1860 market prices for African chattel was in the billions. These incoming, quote, wage slaves, close quote, were the human fuel of our bully industrial manhood. Our cities sank beyond the worst slums of India and China. Millions died in filthy factories, stockyards, slaughterhouses, mines, ships, trains, tenements. Newcomers filled the slots of the maimed and dead as they were carted away. In the Great Plains, William Tecumseh Sherman disgraced his middle name. Quote, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children." Close quote. As in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, indigenous children were torn from their parents. In hellish boarding schools, they suffered physical, psychological, cultural, and sexual abuse. At Little Bighorn, 1876, Lakota war chiefs Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse wiped out 250 U.S. cavalrymen under Custer. 14 years later, in 1890, during a sacred ghost dance, machine guns at Wounded Knee slaughtered some 300 starving Lakota. Commander Nelson A. Miles called it, quote, "a horrible massacre of women and children," close quote. But 20 U.S. soldiers were rewarded with the Congressional Medal of Honor. At Wounded Knee, say the historians, the frontier died. The prairies swarmed with white settler colonists and their trains, towns, trade, taxes, and corporate tyrants. They virtually exterminated the buffalo, stripped the sod, sowed the seeds of a Dust Bowl eco-catastrophe, and, with their livestock, launched cholesterol's attack on the American cardiovascular system, eventually killing millions. A bought Congress handed the barons huge swaths of indigenous land. Their cheap, rickety rails tore through the prairie like infectious lashes on a slave's ravaged back. At Promontory Summit, Utah, 1869, Irishmen working west from Missouri met Chinese coming east from California to link the oceans. Baron Leland Stanford and a cohort were unable to drive in the ceremonial gold spike, so a worker got it done, and corporate flunkies quickly retrieved the spike. Historians still say barons like Stanford built America's industrial machine. But what they really did was forge papers and sent bought Trumpian grifters to Congress, which gave them Hamiltonian tariffs, outrageous graft, and obscene land grants. It was the farmers and workers whose names don't make the history books, who plowed the fields, cut the forests, swung the hammers, suffered mightily, died early. Their blood, sweat, and tears still define our ability to survive and thrive. Quote, "It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn." Close quote. From rolling passenger rail windows quote, sportsmen, unquote, shot countless buffalo, driving the precious animals and the tribes they supported to the brink of extinction. Wall Street sharks did the same to small investors and to the president. In 1869, Jay Gould crashed the stock market to make a killing in gold. Tough guy Grant was out of his league. The Ohio horse whisperer, honest but naive, was no match for the frenzy-feeding barons who tore his presidency to pieces. Grant's scandal-racked Great Barbecue opened the lethal chasm that still divides the American working middle class from the thieves on high. Protected by a legal fortress that relieves them of both fiscal and human responsibility, America's corporate elite is still rich beyond creases. The, quote, Gilded Age, unquote, Mark Twain's term, was run by 400 families based mostly in Midtown Manhattan. They groped our assets, trumped our government, towered above the law. Working families served and died at their doorsteps, while the Hamiltonian elite lit cigars with $100 bills, staged banquets for pet dogs, put diamonds in their teeth, gouged out gargantuan estates, lived as if the arc of justice had no meaning. At the dawn of the American century, the barons became both the elect of God and the select of nature. Puritan theocracy and Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species somehow fused into a social Darwinist sickness. Darwin himself hated slavery and admired John Brown. But riches now signified both Puritan divinity and genetic superiority. No amount of money was ever enough. No contempt for compassion was ever condemned. As in the eyes of the later Ayn Rand, helping the poor became a sin against God and a crime against nature. To be bothered by the general welfare, as mandated in the Constitution, was now to defile the divine order and weaken the, quote, supreme white race. At Wounded Knee, as the Lakota froze in the snow, the U.S. fulfilled the continental manifest destiny of its Jacksonian adolescence. Commanding Officer Nelson Miles completed his imperial trifecta by killing Union workers during the 1894 railway strike led by Eugene V. Debs, then by slaughtering rebels at the empire's newest outposts in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. In its Gilded Winter, the U.S. crushed the indigenous, suppressed farmers and workers, colonized Latin America, took Hawaii and the Philippines, then busted through China's open door to share an imperial gangbang with England, France, Italy, Germany, Russia, and Japan. From 1893 to 1897, the barons hosted a gay 90s that became a Great Depression for the rest of us. Our bully manhood, as Theodore Roosevelt called it, would now bring not a third American Revolution, but a first World War. All right, let's keep rolling here.
Yeah, we are rolling.
Next, Cycle 3, Bully Manhood. A burst of energy. Brian, Debs, Teddy, Wilson. In 1848, a human tsunami hit our shores. It poured in first from Ireland and Germany, then from Southern and Eastern Europe, and later from Latin America, Asia, the Pacific, Africa, the Middle East. The American century's 1900 head count of 76,212,168 nearly doubled the 38,558,371 of 1870, just 3 decades prior. Parts of Boston, New York, Newark, Philadelphia, Baltimore, D.C., Chicago joined Europe and Asia's most diseased and depressed urban hellholes. Tenements teemed with penniless newcomers. As in early Jamestown, they flowed in like filler, worked like dogs, dropped dead, and were quickly replaced. They powered hellish fossil-fired factories, mills, railroads, shipyards, slaughterhouses, packing plants. They suffered en masse from inhuman living conditions, relentless exploitation, on-the-job slaughter, desperate poverty, rampant disease. On a continent bursting with natural resources, riding those waves of cheap labor, we entered our young adulthood, TR's, quote, bully manhood, as the world's #1 industrial power. A technical revolution set the stage. Conceived by Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, utility power lines spiderwebbed our cities. They flashed electrons from coal burners that heated the ecosphere and blackened our air, land, water, and lungs. The phonograph, wireless radio, motion picture, automobile, and airplane all arrived between 1877 and 1905. So did Sigmund Freud's New Psychology, Friedrich Nietzsche's Superman, and Albert Einstein's 4 epic breakthroughs, including E=mc², that in 1905 changed everything. Our body politic shattered into 4 social classes: the robber barons, family farmers, factory workers, and an educated middle class that managed the new industrial machine. At the countercultural vanguard were the Bohemians. Their freewheeling, indigenous souls rode history's magic bus from awakened Northampton and Thoreau's transcendentalism to 1930s radicalism and to the 60s hippie farms, and then deep into the solartopian eco-activism of the 1970s and beyond. In rebellious joy, they lit up our third Great Awakening. At the era's core was a monumental struggle for control of the industrial machine. Each contender had its own messiah. For Southern and Western farmers, things went downhill right after Appomattox. Jefferson's ideal of a yeoman utopia, self-sufficient on the land, growing its own food, fell into the death maw of an industrial cash economy. As homesteading farmers poured into the prairie, they stripped away the sod for grain and cattle. Their ultimate crops were fiscal failure, ecological ruin, and heart-stopping beef and pork fat. Forever strapped for cash, the new pioneers got owned by the rising baronial monopolies. The seed, machinery, rail lines, homes, loans, transportation, and tax payments the farmers needed in the dawning age of corporate agribusiness were all controlled by green-shaded bean counters in faraway cubbies whose lethal pencils sketched their doom. In the South, destitute poor whites and impoverished ex-slaves alike were crushed between the old plantations and the new South factory system. It was more than even those rugged Jacksonian individualists could handle alone. In 1867, the patrons of husbandry arose to promote good farming, civic virtue, and mutual aid. Their Grange meeting halls were safe havens for desperate agrarians under corporate attack. In 1876, the Greenbacker Party demanded freely coined silver and more paper money. Inflation would water down farm mortgages and raise crop prices. The Hearst family liked that. Their silver mines funded mass circulate, quote, yellow, unquote, hate sheets. Their silver mines funded mass circulated yellow hate sheets that howled for imperial war and in corporate greed. In the late 1880s, Grangers and Greenbackers formed farmers' alliances to dodge the monopolies. They birthed co-op market exchanges, credit unions, community banks, and a grassroots infrastructure. It all fed in to the People's Party. Against all odds, these dirt-poor, down-home, quote, populists, unquote, forged a transcendent coalition of Southern and Western, black and white, ex-Democrat and ex-Republican, former Yank and Johnny Reb farmers. They revived the leveler spirit of Tom Paine's agrarian democracy and Ben Franklin's civic virtue. They rebirthed the Minutemen who took Tory land for the greater good. They saw an economy where human need trumped corporate greed. Said populist firebrand, sockless Jerry Simpson, quote, "It is a struggle between the robbers and the robbed," unquote. In Omaha, the populists leapt towards social democracy. Their 1892 People's Party platform demanded votes for women, direct election of U.S. senators, the initiative, referendum, and recall, a reformed judiciary, a strengthened Bill of Rights, a currency based on crops, popular control of the banks and electric utilities, the railroads, steamships, telecommunications networks, and an end to war and empire. Though some populists did want both for overseas markets. For president, they chose the former Iowa Greenbacker and Union General James B. Weaver. Virginia's former General Benjamin Fields would be his VP. So with blue-gray brass topping the ticket, the populists meant to unite mostly white Republican Union veterans in the West with mostly white ex-Confederate Democrats in the South and black ex-slaves who left the party of Lincoln. It was a fragile coalition, but populist candidates counted more than 1 million votes in 1892. They seemed poised at the brink of the unthinkable, uniting white Westerners with black-white Southerners in a brave, new, biracial reconstruction. When the economy crashed in 1893, the People's Party was set to repeat history. The newborn GOP had elected Lincoln in 1860. Why not the populists in 1896? But history threw them a screwball. His name was William Jennings Bryan. At their 1896 convention, grassroots Democrats blamed incumbent President Grover Cleveland and his conservative gold bugs for the raging Great Depression. Amidst the chaos, a young, 35 years old, Nebraska congressman grabs the nomination. A born spellbinder, William Jennings Bryan was raised evangelical. He preached hope and change. Quote, "Food and clothes for the thousands of hungry and ill-clad women and children, the reopening of closed factories, the relighting of fires in darkened furnaces, hope instead of despair, comfort in place of suffering, life instead of death," unquote. But Bryan's actual politics were fake. He was a fitting model for the Cowardly Lion in Frank Baum's populist screed, The Wizard of Oz, which was published in 1900. Bryan's one hard demand was for free silver. His contempt for grassroots populism was tangible. His Democrat running mate was a Maine banker. GOP kingmaker Mark Hanna said that if Bryan won, they'd just shoot him. Nobody thought he was kidding, but why bother? The populists were trapped. Bryan shattered the People's Party. The Westerners joyfully endorsed him, but the Southerners were divided and confused. Opposing Bryan would invite blame for electing McKinley, but supporting him meant becoming Democrats. For a black or white populist in Jim Crow Dixie, that was virtual suicide. Thus was born the duopoly, or two-party systems, signature death trap. In every cycle of our history, it trashes grassroots movements and sabotages social change. If they stuck to their principles and supported their third party, the populists would help elect a Republican. But if they supported a Democrat, their movement would shatter. The mainstream party nominee would betray them. And then, like Humphrey in 1968, Gore in 2000, and Hillary in 2016, they'd lose anyway. It was the modern corporate two-party system's ritual quagmire, the, quote, evil of two lessers, unquote, a disease perfectly designed to kill any real electoral challenge to corporate power. In virtually every crisis election since 1896, the corporate Democratic Party has convened the same circular firing squad for America's grassroots left. In that spirit, Bryan dug the American farmer's political grave. The Western populists had few qualms about leaving the corporate GOP to support a Nebraskan. Out in the prairie, Bryan's being a Democrat was tough to swallow, but bearable. For the Southerners, black and white, to back any Democrat was to swallow Jim Crow, KKK poison. Many did, but they all rightly feared the worst. Bryan sent his hacks to the People's Party convention in 1896. They passionately promised to honor the populist platform if only the farmers would endorse their man. That silver tongue was hard to resist, and, of course, he lied. About a third of the populists supported Eugene V. Debs, the charismatic founder of the American Railway Union. Debs became a labor icon in 1894-5 when President Cleveland, yet another Democrat happy to crush the unions that supported him, jailed Gene for leading a national rail strike. Debs was tall, thin, amiable, uncorruptible, a transcendent writer and speaker, hugely embraced as, quote, the American saint, unquote, by our working middle-class masses. Their world first erupted during the 1877 Great Rail Strike. Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railway lit the fuse. Without warning, he slashed workers' wages, but not his own, by 10%. Furious trainmen grabbed engines, torched rail yards, shot supervisors, shut the system from St. Louis eastward. Dozens were killed by troops sent to crush them on behalf of the corporations. The strike lasted 45 days and spanned 4 states. It paralleled the populist uprising just then spreading through the on-fire farms and fields of the West and South. But Tom Scott and his young aide, Andrew Carnegie, were baronial masters of divide and conquer. America's immigrant working class was atomized by language, race, gender, ethnicity, geography, trade. When strikes threatened to succeed, the barons poured in scabs and then had their, quote, elected mayors and governors send in troops for tax-funded slaughter. When strikes threatened to succeed, the barons just poured in scabs and had their, quote, elected, unquote, mayors and governors send in troops for tax-funded slaughter. Straight as an arrow, Debs opposed the 1877 Great Railway Strike. He worked the rails, then rose through the Union ranks. Trusted everywhere for his honesty and devotion, Gene organized the National Railway Union, meant to unify all train workers into one big industrial family. Busted and imprisoned by Grover Cleveland, whom he'd supported in 1892, Debs became labor's new Honest Abe. Pops and Unionists saw Gene leading a farm labor rural-urban alliance to crush the barons and take national power. They hoped in 1896 that he'd run with Tom Watson, a firebrand Georgia lawyer who embraced a Southern multiracial alliance. In coalition, the West, South, black, white, urban, rural, immigrant, indigenous, farm, labor, feminist, bohemian alliance would transcend the two-party system. The new American century would dawn as a social democracy, not a corporate empire. But at that crucial moment, Debs was behind bars in Woodstock, Illinois, jailed by Cleveland for, quote, conspiring, unquote, to shut down the national rail system. Cautious by nature, Gene stuck with Bryan in the 1896 election. With nowhere else to go, the populace meekly asked the young Nebraskan to carry their banner and to accept Watson as his VP. He did neither. Lacking a unifying leader, the farm labor ships passed in the night. The critical alliance between rural radicals and urban unionists never materialized. In our annals of what-ifs, this was among America's biggest. Had the St. Louis Populist Convention nominated Debs and run him with Watson, could they have forged the broad-based phalanx needed to overthrow the baronial elite? Could they have elected Gene in 1896 or maybe 1900, as the Republicans had elected Lincoln in 1860? Could they have carried a grassroots left alliance far enough into the new century to birth a real, lasting social democracy? Tragically, we'll never know. Once he got the populist nomination, Bryan, of course, blew them off. He ran with a Maine banker. He ignored Watson and the local People's Party candidates. Except for free silver, he endorsed virtually nothing from the populist platform. But Billy Bryan, like the later Bill Clinton, did have charisma. He ran an epic whistle-stop campaign, the era's first political, evangelical, grassroots crusade. He trekked thousands of miles. From the back of his train, he delivered up to 36 spellbinders a day to some 5 million fans come to hear the new agrarian messiah. Passionate crowds hung on his every word. A set of triplets was named William, Jennings, and Bryan. To the frenzied masses, he seemed sure to win, and with a fair vote count, maybe he did. The corporations ran Ohio's Republican Senator William McKinley, as dull as a doctored vote count. His campaign manager, Cleveland steel baron Mark Hanna, the original Karl Rove, raised a staggering $15 million from the super rich. He deployed scores of dirty tricksters, dispatched hundreds of speakers, planted thousands of newspaper articles, spewed out millions of pamphlets, stuffed countless ballot boxes, did whatever he needed to win. It was the primal corporate blitzkrieg, the real precursor to mass 20th century election theft. Along the way, Hanna bragged that he could hire half the working class to shoot the other half, including Bryan, if he'd won. But there was no need. The official vote count gave McKinley a 6 million margin. Hanna's henchmen explained, with perfectly straight faces, that farm animals ate all those Bryan ballots, or they were washed away by floods and hurricanes, or they were lost, then found, having miraculously morphed into votes for McKinley. Bryan's defeat shattered the fragile populist coalition. Westerners angrily blamed Southerners. Southern whites, including Tom Watson, angrily blamed their black allies. Jim Crow retook Dixie. Lynch mobs ran wild. Democrat bigots, often calling themselves populists, rode the KKK back to absolute power. Except in the upper Midwest, agrarian radicals lost their voice. Once America's backbone, the family farm was disenfranchised, decapitated, doomed. Jefferson's yeomen and Jackson's frontiersmen fell into a spiral abyss that ate our small-town democracies and bared the land to corporate rape. Now the face of the Democratic Party, Bryan launched a lifelong career as a vacuous windbag. He loudly opposed our imperial plunge, but helped conquer Cuba. He quit as Secretary of State in 1915 to protest Wilson's awful plunge into World War I. But in exchange, Bryan got nothing of substance for our dying agrarian community. Since the 1896 fiasco, countless fake populists have betrayed the promise of social democracy, trashing the public trust to serve the corporate elite while faking the part of the people's messiah. Divide, confuse, and conquer has been the ruling mantra. Our tragic death spiral has been the consequence. But still we had Debs. After his jail time in Woodstock, Gene took the plunge. The Great Railway Strike lit the fuse on urban radicalism in 1877. The Knights of Labor, our first national union, accepted women, blacks, and the unskilled. It demanded social change, but it would not strike. The barons wanted all unions dead. The workers who made them obscenely rich were useful idiots. Union organizers and peaceful demonstrators were fired, beaten, jailed, shot. But step by bloody step, they gained a foothold. Quote, "Now we stand outcast and starving, mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong." Close quote. From this great rebellion arose the, quote, American saint. Gene Debs's American Railway Union was a radical sanctuary, open to all. Born in Terre Haute to French immigrants, he married at age 30 to the Victorian Kate Metzel, who built him a, quote, house divided, unquote. When Gene came out as a socialist, she fainted. While he traveled ceaselessly, they stayed married and childless for the rest of their days. In 1894, in solidarity with a small contingent of Pullman workers, the ARU launched the second Great Railway Strike and shut down the national system. In response, Grover Cleveland's federal troops killed at least 30 strikers. Hearst and the corporate media called Debs a dictator, an enemy of America. They jailed him for, quote, conspiracy, unquote. From his Woodstock cell, he supported Bryan. But a steady flow of radical writers and organizers turned Gene's head. With time to read and think, he denounced capitalism. Puritan greed could never sustain a just or sane society. Quote, "I am for socialism because I am for humanity. We have been cursed with the reign of gold long enough. Money constitutes no proper basis for civilization." Close quote. Gene's epic leap to a whole new way of thinking thrilled our toiling masses and made him our rock star labor leader. At last, American workers could see an economy answering to human need, not corporate greed or Calvinist empire. Said Debs, quote, Every robber or oppressor in history has wrapped himself in a cloak of patriotism or religion or both, close quote. Like the Quakers and Owenites, Oneidans and abolitionists, American socialists sang of the indigenous. They embraced our common humanity and demanded food, clothing, housing, education, medical care, dignity, a fair share for all. The means of production would be owned by the public, run by the workers. Debs rejected Marx's call for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Instead, throughout Gene's career, the American Socialist Party stuck by the freedoms of speech and press, while the Democrats and Republicans trashed and abused them at will. Debs embodied Abigail's feminism, Paine's agrarian democracy, Franklin's civic virtue, Madison's Bill of Rights, Thoreau's civil resistance, Douglas's abolitionism, Tubman's dogged persistence, Emerson's hatred of war, Lincoln's lyric genius. In the eyes of the Debsians, racism, class, empire, and war were our original sins. Real democracy meant sharing the wealth. It was a human right to be fed, housed, clothed, educated, employed, medically secure. Fueled by tens of millions of immigrants, the Union movement's natural divisions ran even deeper than the populists. Its ethnic diversity was staggering, its language barriers impossible. The eternal infighting of its fragile coalitions drove even the toughest organizers mad. But as the new century dawned, socialist ideals and ideals melded into our But as the new century dawned, socialist ideas and ideals melded into our mainstream. Millions assumed, as long as Gene was around, that the socialist working middle class would soon take power. Debs ran for president in 1900, 1904, and 1908. Huge, frenzied crowds cheered his relentless attacks on the baronial rich. He drew 1 million official votes, likely a vast undercount, in 1912's epic four-way race. Socialists won seats all over the U.S. In 1916, Gene ran for Congress from Terre Haute. Surrounded by devoted family, lifelong friends, and impassioned supporters, his official vote count was 0. While Debs' socialists struggled for a fair vote count, progressive technocrats seized the new century's burst of energy. Messiah number 1 was Teddy Roosevelt, the bull moose. TR hailed from old Long Island Dutch aristocracy. Endowed with patrician wealth, astounding intellect, and volcanic energy, Theodore Roosevelt was a force of nature. Teddy was New York City police commissioner, then mayor, then governor of the Empire State, and gloated, quote, "I killed a Spaniard with my own hands. Look at those damn Spanish dead," close quote. Teddy scorned uppity blacks and suffragette women, radical farmers, and organized labor. But he also swore to bust the decadent baronial monopolies. TR's progressive phalanx was a new technocratic class. They were middle managers, corporate lawyers, financial experts, professors, researchers, government regulators, factory supervisors, industrial farmers, military strategists, teachers, politicians, librarians, skilled workers. The literate, reformist shock troops of the American century's ruling bureaucracy. Proudly puritanical, almost exclusively white and male, the new techno-scientific elect would rule the planet and remake the race. TR was their Oliver Cromwell and Andy Jackson. Asthmatic as a kid, he ranged the western wilds with the passionate persistence of a biblical fanatic. His manic energy seemed to border on the superhuman. He read as many as 4 books a day and wrote countless screeds, including a history of the frontier, whose natural beauty he loved, but whose indigenous he scorned. TR's contempt for immigrant and union rights were also legend. The, quote, health of the race, unquote, demanded that white females bear as many children as possible. He met with African American leader Booker T. Washington, but clearly explained that he felt humans of color were inferior. As for his love of battle, quote, no triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. Quote, armed struggle, he said, thinned the masses, selected the superior, boiled the blood, forged a, quote, master race, unquote. Comfortably rich, Teddy Roosevelt had zero tolerance for cloakroom crooks. The Republican machine wanted him out of New York. In 1900, they conspired to bury him in the vice presidency. Mark Hanna frantically warned them it was a bad idea. Sure enough, to the horror of the party hacks, Tecumseh's curse struck McKinley dead. His accidental successor quickly set out to bust the trusts, bury the unions, conquer a global empire. TR preached a halfway covenant. Corporate capitalism would rule the roost, but it would bend to government intervention. So his, quote, national socialism, unquote, would combine a, quote, square deal, unquote, with progressive regulation. Already on the books were the Interstate Commerce Act, 1887, the Sherman Antitrust Act, 1890, and other impositions meant to curb the barons while leaving their private fiefdoms essentially untouched. Proclaiming himself a, quote, trustbuster, unquote, Teddy became a popular hero by suing to break up U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, and their sibling monopolies. His assaults drew him huge headlines, but his tangible impact was marginal. Wall Street lawyers captured the regulatory commissions. Multicolored stock certificates hid the busted trusts and their interlocking directorates. In 1907, Roosevelt did support a federal child labor law. The Tillman Act banned direct corporate contributions. But Teddy also seeded a Federal Reserve slush fund to bail out barons who repeatedly overreached. In the century to come, in our unique form of lemon socialism, or socialism for the rich, the Fed would slip trillions in unearned cash to bankers who were too big to fail, even for an alleged trust buster like Theodore Roosevelt. Most memorably for the public good, Teddy followed Lincoln and Grant in working to preserve our natural resources. The priceless network of national parks that he helped establish is among the greatest legacies of any president, until Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, and Donald Trump began to rip it apart. In 1908, Teddy handpicked a successor, William Howard Taft. TR and his son set off on safari, where they killed more than 500 African animals. Taft weighed 350 pounds and got famously stuck in the White House bathtub. He also stuck the public with a bevy of regulatory agencies that laundered corporate greed while doing little to check its abuses. In 1912, Teddy demanded that Taft give him back the White House. But at a rigged GOP convention, William Howard Taft dared to deny Teddy Roosevelt the nomination. So TR ran as a, quote, bull moose and split the party. In October 1912, in Milwaukee, Theodore Roosevelt was shot by an angry barkeep. But he spoke another 75 minutes with the bullet, like Andy Jackson's, lodged near his heart. It did stop his presidential campaign, but not his advocacy for an astonishing mix of war and empire, regulation and privilege, conservation and exploitation, racism and misogyny. The four-way 1912 presidential election was, like 1824 and 1860, a sure sign of national crisis. Taken together, TR, Taft, and Debs outpolled 59 to 41% Governor Woodrow Wilson. But the New Jersey Democrat won the Electoral College. Woodrow was the ultimate technocrat. The former president of Princeton held the first PhD in political science. He married the Federal Reserve and Federal Trade Commission to market and tariff reform and to a regulatory revolving door leading straight to corporate boardrooms. Wilson later jailed peace advocates for quoting from his own books, including The New Freedom. Teddy, Taft, and Wilson were the progressive scene setters for history's ultimate imperial crusade. The American century's monopoly capitalist Puritan elect was now primed to conquer, exploit, and remake all of humankind in the name of God, technology, the free market, and fake democracy. Wrote Henry Adams, the grouchy grandson of our grouchy second president, quote, "The outline of the city became frantic in its effort to explain something that denied meaning. Power seemed to have outgrown its servitude and to have asserted its freedom. The cylinder had exploded and thrown great masses of stone and steam against the sky. The city had the air and movement of hysteria, and the citizens were crying in every accent of anger and alarm that the new force must, at any cost, be brought under control. Prosperity never before imagined, power not yet wielded by man, speed never reached by anything but a meteor, had made the world irritable, nervous, querulous, unreasonable, and afraid." Next, Springtime, Bohemian Rhapsody. In those astonishing days of modern industrial shock and awe, some of us were young and joyous and knew no fear. For these of us, the new century was a Bohemian Rhapsody, a yippee springtime born of magical new music, fabulous literature, transcendent art, great sex, utopian community, and all the poetic yearnings for social democracy and communal joy that come with each awakened wave of indigenous uproar. This cycle got woke by African Americans who never took slavery lying down and did not roll over for Jim Crow either. High atop the food chain, Booker T. Washington established Alabama's Tuskegee Institute to educate black professionals. He embraced the ruling corporate ethos, but he trained African Americans to fight on their own terms. Racism, he said, was a, quote, cancer gnawing at the heart of this republic, close quote. W.E.B. Du Bois became a communist, Harvard's first PhD, He wanted a talented 10th to reshape the nation. In 1909, he helped form the multiracial, still fighting, National Association for the Advancement of Color People. Marcus Garvey, the flamboyant Jamaica-born firebrand, preached Black power. They all danced to a transcendent new music that rolled out of the Big Easy and changed the world: jazz. Jazz's roots were in the First Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s, when blacks brought their drums to those raucous outdoor revivals. The shocking impact of African rhythms on European hymns made us all dance and shout, terrifying Calvin's clergy. Over the next 150 years, America's musical gumbo shimmered and stirred. Cotton Belt slaves invented three-chord blues for the beat-up guitars they strummed on rickety porches after endless hours of unpaid toil. Minstrel shows and sheet music spread reels and ragtime, a new pop music invented by the black St. Louis-based genius Scott Joplin. New Orleans was the jazz root. America's diverse mecca of 250,000 souls somehow supported 3 classical orchestras and 2 opera companies. Its best musicians were often mixed-race, quote, Creoles of color, unquote, like Homer Plessy of Plessy versus Ferguson, whose genetic ancestry defied description. And in one of history's great mashups, racist bigots inadvertently midwifed the new century's transcendent soundtrack. As the populists lost their bearings in the 1890s, Jim Crow ruled that Creoles were black. In an age of white supremacy, a single drop of African blood somehow trumped the race card. So the Big Easy's mixed-race musicians migrated from the opera and concert halls to the bars and dance halls, where their high-blown virtuosity met the low-down blues. But the blues were slow, and ragtime was scripted. When Jim Crow jammed them together, the unintended consequence was an epic fusion that blew open a musical crack, free-form improvisation, where the light shone in. African rhythms transformed the Lord's hymnals into spiritual music, then gospel. In Congo Square, ancestral drumming, call and response, and raucous freestyling fused into a joyous Delta symphony. NOLA jammed, sang, and danced to Cajun, folk, hillbilly, indigenous, African, Caribbean, military, klezmer, Yiddish, spiritual, slave songs, European folk, arias, tone poems, you name it. Amidst the city's exceptional diversity, a preteen, Louis Armstrong, picked a trumpet out of the trash and wailed on it from the back of a Jewish family's junk wagon. Through the new century, jazz morphed in mysterious ways, conducting a musical mystery tour through swing, bebop, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, rap, hip-hop, and whatever the hell comes next. To that beat marched the new matriarchs. Despite their allegedly hallowed perch on the family pedestal, activist women were regularly beaten and abused by random misogynists, often in uniform, calling themselves Christians. But with its 1848 Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, the nascent feminist movement demanded equal rights, including the vote, property ownership, reproductive freedom, and more. In 1872, New York's Quaker-raised Susan B. Anthony was busted for trying to vote. But Wyoming had already, in 1869, granted female suffrage. So did other populist Western states, like Montana, which sent Jeannette Rankin to Congress in 1917, where she voted against U.S. entry into World War, and then did it again in 1941. Uppity women were at the core of populist and socialist movements that demanded their equal rights and public franchise. Quaker-led demonstrations upped the ante. In 1919, Alice Paul and her suffragette sisters hunger-struck after being jailed for marching at the White House. Their jailers physically abused them, a big mistake. The lurid headlines tipped the balance. In 1920, women became our voting majority. The 19th Amendment more than doubled the eligible American electorate. Then, in the early 1920s, Alice wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, demanding, simple enough, that women be treated on a legal par with men. A century later, that Equal Rights Amendment remains unratified. Out on the prairie, the populist Mary Ellen Lease demanded her fellow farmers raise less corn and more hell. Union organizers like Mother Mary Jones and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn fought to abolish slave slavery. The radical feminist Emma Goldman pioneered gay rights. She, of course, was deported. Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to win birth control and reproductive freedom. Over the years, through its promotion of sex education and contraception, Planned Parenthood would prevent more abortions than any evangelical movement could ever dream of doing. The bisexual Mabel Dodge hosted bohemian love fests for the new century's first hippies. An avant-garde literary maven, Mabel's Lower Manhattan mansion was a salon of choice for hot young activists and artistes like her sometime lover, Jack Reed. These bohemians swayed to ragtime, grooved to jazz, lived great poetry, painted great pictures, made random love with reckless abandon, danced for joy on the cultural corpse of Puritan prudery. Max Eastman's witty Masses magazine merged leftist politics with urbane writing and flip satire. Quote, "In the summer, I'm a nudist. In the winter, I'm a Buddhist." Close quote. The festivities were fueled in part by cannabis and peyote that seeped in from a tribal culture and Western frontier being driven near extinction. Dodge later moved to Taos, New Mexico, and dove deep into the slipstream of indigenous spirituality. Her autobiography shines with nature-based vision questing, soon to ignite a psychedelic whirlwind. Chicago's 1893 World Council on Religion stirred Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jain, Christian Scientist, Baha'i, Zen, Theosophist, and other religions into an early Woodstock of spiritual ferment. It moved Nikola Tesla, whose genius helped electrify the nearby World Exposition and the world itself. In 1902, Harvard's William James, who was Ralph Emerson's godson, compiled Varieties of Religious Experience, a wholly divine catalog that opened the doors of diverse perception and spiritual wisdom. Life forbids, he said, quote, a premature closing of our accounts with reality, close quote. Reborn transcendentalism electrified the arts. Brilliant creatives like Mary Ellen Key, Mark Twain, Charlotte Gilman, Randolph Bourne, Amory Lowell, Carl Sandburg, Louise Bryant, Lincoln Steffens remade writing for a radical era. Upton Sinclair's 1906 Jungle aspired, like Common Sense, to ignite a new revolution. But the nauseating filth it exposed in the meatpacking industry spawned instead a new generation of vegetarians. Quote, "I aimed at the public heart," Upton warned, "and by accident I hit it in the stomach," close quote. Ida Tarbell's History of the Standard Oil Company muckraked John D. Rockefeller for all his hard-knuckle brutality. By questioning the divinity of our founders, Charles Beard's 1913 An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States joined other progressive heresies then rocking academia. Jack London's Call of the Wild evoked nature at its crystalline peak. His Iron Heel warned of a coming American fascism. The stark photo images of Jacob Riis and Louis Hine opened the public eye to our urban slums. So did Alfred Stieglitz, German-born spouse of the natural painter Georgia O'Keeffe. The Ashcan school of socialist painters like Robert Henry and George Bellows sparked a revolution in oil and canvas. Their feisty 1908 New York Armory exhibit featured a pine tree emblem from the first American Revolution. Teddy denounced them as, quote, degenerate. The New York Times called them, quote, cousins to the anarchists, unquote. The Ashcan liked that. Futuristic fantasies like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, Ignatius Donnelly's Caesar's Column, H.G. Wells's Modern Utopia, and Frank Baum's satiric Oz opened our eyes to the yellow brick vision of a parallel mindset. Utopian colonies and socialist collectives lit up the landscape, again, with indigenous spiritualism, tribal sharing, and sexual adventure. Helicon Hall in New Jersey, Georgia's Christian Commonwealth, freewheeling collectives at Cave Mills, Tennessee, and Kaweah River, California, all fed the reborn tides of a youthful transcendentalism. As the frontier disappeared, our indigenous DNA evoked its timeless love for Mother Nature. In 1872, Grant followed Lincoln's preservation of Yosemite with humankind's first national park at Yellowstone. Scotsman John Muir fought to save California's Hetch Hetchy Valley from being dammed, then founded the Sierra Club, spawning a century of organized eco-activism. Teddy left us an exceptional national park system. He soiled the deed with racist blather against the indigenous, but he preserved their spirit in millions of acres of land and water essential to our survival, and still under attack from relentless corporatists trashing our earth for private greed. The Biltmore estate of G.W. Vanderbilt, a third-generation baron, launched western North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest. Gifford Pinchot and George W. Schenck pioneered the green science of sustainable forestry. Preservationist pioneers rose up everywhere to save our earth from corporate extinction. At the grassroots of this epic bohemian spring, millions marched for workers' rights. An 1886 national strike for the 8-hour day ended when a bomb killed 8 people in Chicago's Haymarket Square. Nobody knows who threw it, but 8 anarchists were arrested and 4 were hanged. In 1889, the hated steel baron, Henry Frick, ordered Pennsylvania's South Fork Dam lowered to accommodate his carriage. When it broke, the infamous Johnstown flood killed 2,209 people. Frick was never prosecuted for that. In 1892, Frick's private thugs murdered some 30 strikers at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mills near Pittsburgh. Frick was never prosecuted for either mass killing. An angry anarchist did shoot him, but he lived until 1919, when he died of syphilis. Among the working millions, the humanist spirit of Tom Paine's Common Sense and Ben Franklin's Poor Richard were reborn in mass circulation newspapers like the Appeal to Reason of Girard, Kansas. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World, our most radical union, erupted in Chicago. The one-eyed Big Bill Haywood inspired guerrilla wobblies who came in boxcars, slept in hobo camps, wore red and black overalls, ignited strikes, then slipped away into the night. Angry legions of American workers raged, organized, marched, and struck for equality, freedom, survival, dignity. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, indigenous, female, gay, immigrant, unskilled, homeless, destitute. The IWW took us all in. In 1912, we struck the original mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, still mostly worked by women. With immigrants who spoke a dozen languages and hailed from everywhere, the Wobblies sparked a feminist crusade for life that embraced both bread and roses, decent pay, social justice, a chance to escape poverty and oppression, to love and laugh. Saying the anarchist Emma Goldman, quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution," close quote. When the mothers of Lawrence sent their kids out of harm's way to stay with other Union families, crazed police attacked them at a local train station, outraging the nation. In the silk mills of Patterson, immigrant workers joined bohemian artistes in a transcendent symphony of plays and pageants. Millions marched in unison. Still more flocked to hear Debs, Haywood, and their awakened unionists proclaim a new humanist dawn. On April 20th, 1914, federal machine guns raked a strikers' camp at Rockefeller's coal mines in Ludlow, Colorado. 24 died, mostly women and children. In upstate New York, Cleveland, Columbus, Memphis, Nashville, the Tennessee Valley, Jacksonville, San Antonio, Nebraska, Los Angeles, Colorado Springs, Sacramento, Seattle, and elsewhere, socialist activists seized control of newborn electric utilities. These public-owned munis still produce cheaper, cleaner, safer, more reliable juice than the baronial investor-owned utilities that still plague our planet. From this awakened eruption of shared sustainability sprang the New Deal, Social Security, civil rights, New Frontier, Great Society, peace and justice movements, No Nukes, Solartopia, Occupy, Black Lives Matters, Sandinista, Me Too, and so many other movements riding the ever-evolving stream of the peace, justice, and eco-indigenous consciousness fighting to shape our lives around a humanist vision. With an indigenous spirit embedded deep in our DNA, America has rocked to our radical creatives in the awakened 1730s and transcendentalist 1840s. It rolled again in this turn of the 20th century, Bohemian spring. It would be reborn in the radical upwellings of the Great Depression, the Yippie 60s, the Solartopian 70s, and deep into the new millennium of yet another generational uprising. From the volcanic core of these epic upheavals springs an evergreen tribal force, the cyclical rising of our indigenous spirit. At its heart, Eugene V. Debs saw that all humans must be fed, housed, educated, cared for, that the Bill of Rights and personal freedom must be respected, that monopolies must be owned by the public and must be made to serve people before profit, that poverty must be abolished, democracy enhanced, empire ended, the planet preserved, war forever banned. When all that happens, Jean said, quote, we shall have a literature and an art such as the troubled heart and brain of human beings never before conceived. We shall have beautiful thoughts and sentiments and a divinity in religion such as humankind, weighted down by the machine, could never have imagined. The time has come to regenerate society. We are on the eve of a universal change. Next, summer, Woodrow Wilson's War. The demand for that universal change thrilled the better angels of our American century, but their springtime of hope was soon incinerated in a hot summer of imperial war and autocratic repression. The baronial goal was to crush the socialist awakening and enshrine the rule of corporate white supremacy on a global scale. Led by T.R. and Wilson, the Calvinist elect of our city on the hill made an illegal, anti-human leap to world empire. They brought mass murder, eco-suicide, and what Jack London called an iron heel. In 1914, as American soldiers gunned down striking workers, the madness of war engulfed Europe. Our populists, socialists, and bohemians wanted no part of it. Instead, they demanded public control of our major institutions, preserve our farms, pay our workers fairly, provide food, housing, clothing, medical care, and education for all. There was never a security-based imperative for us to conquer other countries. We were never in danger of being invaded or occupied by anyone. A phalanx of fierce anti-imperialists, led by Mark Twain, demanded an end to both war and empire. As Twain put it, quote, it was impossible to save the great republic. She was rotten to the heart. Lust of conquest had long ago done its work. Trampling upon the helpless abroad had taught her by a natural process to endure with apathy the like at home. Close quote. Accordingly, wrote T.R., for the young giant of the West, quote, no triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. Close quote. Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge howled for global conquest. The, quote, march of the flag, unquote, would bring us the riches of empire, the cheap labor, natural resources, and bottomless markets of Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. We were, quote, on the threshold of our career as the first power of Earth. Close quote. We'd put Persia to shame, become richer than Rome, leave the Brits in the dust. It began with Hawaii. Christian missionaries came to, quote, save, unquote, islanders who've been pretty mahalo for a very long time. In 1840, a Catholic priest imported beech thorns, curtailing the native joy of going heedlessly barefoot. Mosquitoes arrived a few years earlier in the water barrels of British and American ships. In 1893, pineapple baron Sanford Dole conquered the archipelago, then asked President Cleveland for annexation. Grover hesitated, but in 1898, William McKinley, quote, went down on my knees, unquote, and got the aloha straight from God. The U.S., he said, had, quote, no choice but to civilize a backward nation, unquote. Hawaii was, of course, peaceful, literate, advanced, and far more civilized than her bestial conquerors. Following on centuries of sophisticated governance, Hawaii embraced a written constitution and a much-loved multilingual songwriting queen, Liliuokalani. But never mind. McKinley also sent the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor. It was allegedly to support Cuban rebels fighting to oust the Spanish Empire that dated to Columbus. But in 1898, the Maine blew up, killing 266 Americans. The Yellowhearst Press ran pornographic drawings of naked white women being molested by swarthy, bearded Spaniards. It was a primal scream for an imperial war. Native divers later confirmed that the Maine blew up from the inside, probably from coal dust. Spain did not sink that boat. But never mind. Roosevelt's Rough Riders rampaged through Cuba, firing their pistols, killing random locals, conquering the island for the new American empire. Then we, quote, liberated the Philippines. Twain called the Jungle War, 1898 to 1903, quote, a mess, a quagmire, close quote. Our soldiers became uniformed assassins. Some 4,000 died. So did 250,000 Filipinos in guerrilla resistance, in concentration camps, and in gratuitous mass slaughter that echoed Wounded Knee and portended Vietnam. Since the U.S. was famously born in anti-imperial revolution, we've always denied being an empire. Instead, we conquered a, quote, instill democracy, close quote, and, quote, teach them a lesson. We let the locals elect their own leaders. But if we dislike who they choose, like the Seminole Osceola or the Filipino Aguinaldo, both of whom we beheaded under white flags of peace, well, then they can try again, for their own good. Thus, our taxpayer-funded military has made the world safe for corporate plunder. Quote, it's all a racket, close quote, wrote General Smedley Butler, who said his troops pillaged Latin America for, quote, the boys on Wall Street, unquote. In 1900, Britain, France, Germany, and the U.S. kicked in China's open door, creating spheres of influence for corporate commerce. In 1903, TR fomented a, quote, revolution, close quote, in Colombia. He concocted the country of Panama, had a constitution written in a New York hotel room, bequeathing us a canal with a 99-year lease. In 1905, Japan beat the Russians, becoming the first non-white nation to defeat a European power since Toussaint Louverture's Haitians beat the French a century before. In 1907, TR sent his Great White Fleet, our big stick, to circle the globe. We claimed dominance over the Western Hemisphere, the Pacific, much of Asia and Africa. In the American century, we invaded most of Earth's non-white nations at least once. In the 1910s, in Europe, Japan, and the U.S., the baronial upper crust somehow longed for larger war. 4 decades had passed since Prussia marched quickly in and out of Paris. Somehow, all that peace, love, and understanding were more than the elite could bear. It was time to kill again. Reading the literature of the day can be mind-bending. In our, quote, bully manhood, peace had become stale. Society was soft. It was time for guns and gas. Nationalistic mass murder would make the white blood flow again. Agrarian Democrats, socialist unionists, anti-imperial intellectuals, Quakers, and otherwise sane humans were aghast. But as Adam Hochschild writes in his superb To End All Wars, the idea that mass death would be wonderful spread like a cancer. In 1914, in Sarajevo, a nationalist nut murdered Austria's Archduke Ferdinand and his pregnant wife. Lunacy erupted. For no rational reason, the Serbs, Russians, Brits, French, and Italians lined up against the Germans, Austrians, and Turks. With apparently nothing better to do, Prussia's idiot Kaiser sent his army screaming towards Paris. The French raced out in taxis, on horseback, riding bicycles, by foot. Baguettes in hand, they met La Boche about 70 miles shy of the Eiffel Tower. Trenches were dug, poison gas spewed, machine guns blazed, bombs fell, hell itself erupted. Over the next 4 years, at least 10 million humans died in battle. Countless more perished in the plagues that followed. To this day, it's impossible to make sense of exactly how or why peaceful, prosperous Europe turned itself into an apocalyptic inferno. But it did. Woodrow Wilson found a Hades closer to home. The infamous bandito, Pancho Villa, danced along the Mexican border. With all the panache of a Latin Charlie Chaplin, Villa was literally making a feature film about himself, taunting the gringo colossus. More serious revolutionaries, like Emiliano Zapata, fought for social justice. El Presidente was not amused. Like Polk before him, Wilson sent our troops crashing into Mexico City, killing the usual innocents. Quote, our little brown brothers, as Wilson called them, must be, quote, taught a lesson. Then war broke out in Europe. Wilson quickly recalled U.S. troops from the halls of Montezuma. He campaigned as the peace lover who'd kept us out of war, and he won a second term. Then he jumped into the World War with both bloody jackboots. The groundwork was carefully laid. In 1915, the British passenger ship Lusitania had sailed for London from New York. The Germans said she illegally carried weapons and promised to sink her under the rules of war. Full-page newspaper ads warned Americans not to take passage. Woodrow Wilson ignored all that. So did 1,959 passengers and crew. 2 German torpedoes hit the Lusitania in the Irish Sea. She sank like a rock, killing 1,198 passengers, including 128 Americans. Conspiracy theorists yelled that the torpedoes must have hit those illegal munitions the president said weren't on board. Like the Maine, deep-sea divers later found the Lusitania. And, of course, she was loaded with munitions that had blown through the side of the boat, sinking her in an instant. But never mind. A, quote, horrified, unquote, Wilson dispatched hordes of high-paid shills to assault all things Teutonic. Sauerkraut became, quote, Liberty cabbage. Street names like Beethoven and Mozart, Schiller and Goethe, turned into numbers. Our largest immigrant group, German Americans, became, quote, barbaric Huns. In 1916, Wilson's re-election deeply divided the progressive and socialist movements. His image as an enlightened reformer hid his bigoted core. Born in Virginia, Woodrow's father was a Confederate chaplain. As a boy, Woodrow briefly met Robert E. Lee. As president, Wilson pushed Jim Crow segregation. He staged a White House viewing of D.W. Griffith's grotesquely racist Birth of a Nation. The film made heroes of the KKK and degraded African Americans. Woodrow loudly loved it. Wilson's progressive leap ensnared the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, a cigar maker who'd come here from England. Most barons wanted unions obliterated. Wilson chose to co-opt their leadership. His 1914 Clayton Antitrust Act, which he called Labor's Magna Carta, gave unions official standing until the Supreme Court gutted the bill. As Wilson's pet union, Gomper's AFL became the, quote, business organization, unquote, of the skilled elite. It struck for better wages and working conditions, but it shunned women, blacks, immigrants, the unskilled, the overtly radical. The corporate bulwark of the upper working class, the AFL broke the strikes of other unions and embraced the axioms of the imperial capitalist state. In trade for White House access and for crushing his socialist rivals, Gompers cheered the empire and its world war. On March 1st, 1917, the Brits published a, quote, Zimmermann telegram, unquote, allegedly revealing a German plot to help Mexico retake the Southwest James K. Polk had so profitably annexed. On Hearst's front pages, raping, pillaging, Lusitania-sinking Huns made those Maine-sinking Spaniards look meek. In April 1917, secure in a second term, Wilson ditched that, quote, he kept us out of war shtick and demanded Congress declare war. He would make the world safe for democracy. 6 senators and 50 representatives, including Jeanette Rankin, voted no. Millions marched in opposition. The populist, farm labor, union, socialist, bohemian majority saw the European slaughter as yet another, quote, rich man's war and poor man's Holocaust. But Rockefeller, Morgan, and their fellow barons had lent the Brits and French far more money than the Germans. Debs, the Wobblies, the Social Democrats, the Bohemians shouted that our troops were being sent to kill and be killed for corporate profits. As in the Civil War, the draft ravaged America's working families. Radical organizers resisted. Quakers went to prison. Farmers and workers chopped off fingers and toes. Thousands deserted their units and fled to Mexico and Canada. Amidst the anti-war upheaval, socialists captured some 1,200 public offices in 340 American cities, including 79 mayors in 24 states. New York's Meyer London and Wisconsin's Victor Berger won seats in Congress. Millions signed calls for non-cooperation. A mighty tide of socialism, said the Akron Beacon-Journal, was about to inundate the country. The empire, of course, struck back. Wilson's 1917 Espionage Act revived John Adams's 1798 Sedition Act, aimed at the press. Congress purged Berger and barred London. Peace advocates were fired, jailed, beaten, shot. Dissing Wilson, even in private, became a 10-year felony. So did carrying placards quoting his own books. The U.S. Supreme Court, in Schenck, absurdly equated draft resistance with, quote, shouting fire in a crowded theater. But as Yippie activist Abby Hoffman later explained, they were in fact shouting theater in a crowded fire. In 1917, Russian workers and peasants overthrew the Tsar. Their revolution terrified the global corporate elites. In the mind of Teddy, Wilson, and their ilk, radical activism, like the witches of Salem, posed a deadly threat to Christian civilization. In June 1918, the feds locked up Debs. Now in his 60s, Gene fought fearlessly for peace. Throughout his career, he and his American Socialist Party maintained a far deeper commitment to the Bill of Rights and all it represented than did their Democrat and Republican rivals. At a rally in Canton, government stenographers, thankfully, recorded Gene's magnificent stump speech. He was charged with a 10-year felony. In a legendary trial, closely watched by the entire nation, Debs refused to mount a formal defense. But on September 11th, 1918, exactly 2 months before the war ended, Gene delivered a monumental 2-hour oratorio for peace and justice. The corporate rich, he said, have, quote, always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. Close quote. Resisting capitalism's greedy carnage, said Debs, united humankind with a common bond, a shared spirit, timeless and immutable. Quote, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on the earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Close quote. Europe reeled toward bankruptcy. Russia exploded with revolution. Exhaustion reigned. A truce had to come. But in barged the doughboys. With fresh grunts and guns, Wilson tipped the balance to the Brits and French. Morgan and Rockefeller got their money. Then the, quote, tin Jesus, close quote, descended on Paris to proclaim victory in his war to end all wars. More than 116,000 Americans laid dead alongside 10 million Europeans. Starvation, plague, and the Spanish influenza piled up corpses by the million. As peace talks opened at Versailles, Wilson demanded an imperial League of Nations and leniency for a German people he'd libeled for years as barbarians and Huns. As he rode in an open car through the streets of Paris, waving his high hat, frenzied mobs cheered the conquering white supremacist as a prophet of peace. Thanks to himself, Wilson crowed, these hellish hot summers of war and mass death would end forever. It was an apocalyptic delusion. Next, fall, Red Scare, the Palmer Raids. The Great War's, quote, Great Migration, close quote, brought millions of Southern blacks to northern industrial cities to work in the arms industry. Deadly riots over the usual racial flashpoints, political power, social status, caste, jobs, housing, access to beaches, sexual innuendo, alleged insults, left dozens dead. In Houston, August 1917, white police assaulted black soldiers assigned to guard a new military base. 16 people died. The Army indicted 118 black soldiers, convicted 110, sentenced 63 to life, hanged 19. No whites were convicted of anything. Wilson pumped Jim Crow deep into the federal bloodstream. His military thoroughly abused its segregated soldiers, many of whom fled to French units, winning countless medals for valor. Back home, Woodrow's beloved KKK made sure black vets could neither vote nor live in the peace for which they'd allegedly fought. After armistice, as usual after a war, the economy collapsed. General strikes paralyzed Seattle, the steel industry, mines, railroads, factories. The fall reaction turned ugly, lethal, fascistic. Coined in Italy by Benito Mussolini, the term fascism meant simply corporate control of the state. In Manawan, West Virginia, 10 people died, including the mayor, in a 1920 shootout between Union miners and Baldwin Felt's corporate thugs. Sheriff Sid Hatfield sided with his hillbilly kin. A jury later cleared Hatfield of murder charges, but in 1921, Felt's men executed Sid in broad daylight as he came unarmed to another courthouse. The shooters did no jail time. Afflicted with lethal working conditions and grinding poverty, coal country exploded. Some 13,000 underpaid, overworked miners grabbed their guns and wrapped bandanas around their throats. Their, quote, redneck army, close quote, marched on the mines at Blair Mountain, which has since been decapitated by mountaintop removal. President Warren G. Harding sent warplanes to drop poison gas on the striking workers. At least 100 marchers died. Nearly 1,000 were indicted. Many rotted in prison for years to come. Nationwide, our diverse working class, now including thousands of war vets, seethed with rage. Thanks to Wilson, Gomper's AFL got a seat at many bargaining tables, winning better wages, working conditions, and the right to organize key industry. But in the cold autumn of post-war fascism, corporate power crushed the socialists and wobblies. Armed with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and with Gompers by his side, Woodrow Wilson ran a new witch hunt. His Red Scare putsch shredded the Constitution. From November 1919 to January 1920, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, a self-proclaimed Quaker, launched Gestapo-style raids meant to crush resistance to corporate capitalism. Palmer's warrantless agents smashed into IWW and Socialist Party offices, union meeting centers, public rallies, the private homes of suspected Social Democrats and peace advocates. Mocking due process, the administration forcibly deported activists of Russian descent, including the gay rights pioneer, Emma Goldman. Grassroots outreach became a life-threatening dare. The homegrown populist socialist belief that public should own society's major industries and operate them for the general welfare officially became a, quote, foreign ideology. For the next 100 years, no independent party demanding social democracy, ecological protection, or an end to empire will be tolerated by America's two-party duopoly. Meaningful social change now demanded an impossible leap from the rock of the corporate Democrats to the hard place of third-party politics. Wilson's putsch enthroned imperial monopoly capitalism atop a velvet-covered fortress. It was festooned with illusions of democracy, but its iron heels aimed to crush the periodic uprisings of a divided public taught to view social democracy and democratic socialism as a satanic seduction. While trashing it at home, Wilson descended on Europe to celebrate a ravaged world made safe for democracy. Wilson's intervention turned a negotiable stalemate into a crushing victory. At the Versailles Treaty talks, he proposed an explicitly racist, pan-imperial League of Nations. It meant to unite Europe's conquering Caucasians, plus Japan, in the corporate gouging of Africa, Asia, the Balkans, Latin America. The Allies loved the League, but without a hint of irony, Wilson now begged mercy for all those, quote, Huns and barbarians he'd so senselessly slaughtered. The Brits and French were incensed, completely ignoring America's, quote, tin Jesus, close quote. Their Versailles Treaty stripped Germany bare and mocked its ravaged soul. Soon enough, a bankrupt, humiliated fatherland puked up Adolf Hitler. His apocalyptic firestorm of bigotry and hate should have surprised no one. Wilson's imperial, quote, war to end all wars, close quote, had predictably paved the way to the next one. In 1919, Woodrow suffered a debilitating stroke. As Nancy Reagan would do some 65 years later, Wilson's second wife, Edith, hid the president's true derangement. She became our first de facto female chief executive. Atop a nation deeply embittered by a useless, worthless war, the Senate nixed the League of Nations. Like the social democracy he crushed, like the Constitution he shredded, like the millions he doomed, Wilson's Calvinist vision for a white supremacist world order died in the post-war ice storm of fascist reaction. The American century's techno-messiah suffered a debilitating stroke and ended his presidency in a virtual coma. He perpetuated a fraudulent intervention, illegally smashed the Socialist Party and radical labor movement, enshrined a federal Jim Crow, enthroned for a century to come a two-party machine dedicated to imperial conquest and corporate dominion. As dementia claimed the great peacemaker, Spanish flu killed some 50 million Europeans and more than 500,000 Americans. Quote, madness, Woodrow mourned, has entered everything. Next, winter, the Roaring Twenties. The Great War ended with those who tried to stop it still locked in prison. A generation's hopes were buried in Europe's desecrated soil. The seeds of the next bloodbath quickly took root. Among the lost was Quentin Roosevelt. Teddy's youngest son of 4 was shot out of French skies at age 20. TR's, quote, blessed rogue, unquote, was the family favorite. Just 2 months after armistice, our most vigorous imperial fanatic died at 60 of a broken heart, and maybe from the lead bullet lodged next to it. TR's transcendent niece, Eleanor, soon revived his boundless energy and formidable intellect, but with very different values. In the decades to come, this magnificent American matriarch bent the arc of history toward the global peace and social justice her martial uncle had so thoroughly scorned. Wilson's intervention lasted 18 months. Some 4,700,000 American men and women were deployed. After armistice, with no declaration of war, some 7,000 were sent to crush the Russian Revolution and restore the Tsar. 70 Americans died. Wilson left scores of nonviolent activists to rot in prison. For the, quote, crime, unquote, of preaching peace, Debs was condemned to a federal prison in Atlanta. The Indiana-born icon was stripped of his citizenship and denied the right to vote. In 1920, Gene ran for president from his cell in Georgia. The near million ballots counted for him included countless women voting for the first time. Many suffered outrageous abuse. In 1918, Alice Paul and her suffragette sisters were jailed for peaceably marching at the White House and for carrying a sign literally quoting Woodrow Wilson. Alice hunger-struck. The tube rammed down her throat, lit up a major media storm. The 19th Amendment was ratified in time for the 1920 election. By then, Edith Wilson was running the country. America was exhausted from its third cycle of upheaval, war, and reaction. Warren G. Harding, an amiable small-town Ohio newspaper editor, inaugurated another winter's ideological hibernation. We need, quote, normalcy, he said, quote, an end to uproar, unquote. Norman Thomas was Harding's hometown newspaper delivery boy and a rising young socialist. He got the affable Ohioan to free Debs. So after 3 years in a federal prison cell, the American saint came straight to the Oval Office to shake Harding's hand. In Terre Haute, 50,000 cheering fans joyously greeted their prodigal son, though apparently none of them had voted to make him a congressman 5 years earlier. In 1924, Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette ran for president. He supported Wilson in 1912, but fiercely opposed his imperial intervention. Being a U.S. senator protected him from arrest, as being a congressman might have protected Debs. In the tradition of America's left third parties, Fighting Bob supported universal health care, public ownership of the railroads, fair wages, women's rights, environmental protection, and more. Running for president on a revived progressive ticket, Bob carried 17% of the national vote, along with Wisconsin's electors. But when he died in 1925, a year later, the party disintegrated. La Follette and Debs had evolved directly from indigenous America through Franklin, Paine, and agrarian populism. When Jean died in 1926, at age 70, the first phase of America's industrial, grassroots, democratic socialism died with him. Debs' socialists and La Follette's progressives married Madison's Bill of Rights with mass movements for grassroots social democracy. They advocated racial, gender, and ethnic equality, freedom of speech, press, and religion, and an economy geared to serve human needs, not corporate greed. The indigenous power of these eternal ideals never left the American century. 6 times Norman Thomas ran for president on their unquenchable alchemy. A century later, they still ignite our awakened fires. William Jennings Bryan's oratorical flair also remained intact. His finest hour came in 1915, when he quit as Secretary of State after Wilson went nuts over the Lusitania. In his dotage, Bryan blamed the World War on godlessness. After the 1925 Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee, in our first live courtroom radio broadcast, the legendary labor lawyer, Clarence Darrow, suggested that teaching both evolution and the Bible would let students make up their own minds. The aging Nebraska Democrat fell too ill to give a summary rebuttal, but the jury took just 8 minutes to ban evolution from Tennessee schools. William Jennings Bryan died just 5 days later. His epitaph was the anti-modern conservatism of another winter's aftermath. In the corporatized wake of war and reaction, with our family farms failing, small-town America arose in anguish. Like the indigenous shamans of the Lakota ghost dance, 1920s Bible thumpers like Billy Sunday preached the old-time religion to bewildered congregations losing their way of life. The Ku Klux Klan ramped up the hate. In November 1915, their racist terror was reborn at Stone Mountain, Georgia. Wilson's ugly embrace of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation fed yet another white supremacist scourge. Until the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, our doors had been open to the world. In 1908, TR's Gentleman's Agreement stopped immigration from Japan. In 1917, Wilson okayed a literacy test meant to kill the surge of immigrants coming from Europe. Then came a nation-based quota system, choking the human flow that helped shape us for 3 centuries. In May 1921, a white mob torched the prosperous, quote, Black Wall Street, close quote, section of Tulsa. At least 55 citizens died, maybe more than 300. A.C. Jackson, a prominent black surgeon, was murdered while being hauled to jail for no good reason. White police locked up 6,000 of the district's 10,000 black residents. Some 35 blocks of hotels, hospitals, businesses, libraries, newspapers, and homes were obliterated. At least 9,000 people were made homeless. Throughout the post-war era, Jim Crow lynchings and violent vote theft fed the Democrats' death grip on Dixie. In Chicago and Detroit, race riots killed dozens. In August 1922, Irish resistance leader Michael Collins was assassinated. The charismatic guerrilla fighter led the armed IRA anti-Brit resistance. But after the war, he wanted peace. It got him killed. 7 decades of senseless murder ended only when Bill Clinton, in his sole moment of true greatness, brokered a peace. In August 1925, as Bryan's monkey trial ended, some 40,000 Klansmen showed their sheets in D.C. The Klan was then gutted by internal corruption. Official bigotry peaked with the 1927 murder trial of Italian-born anarchists Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Their ritual electrocution sparked global outrage. A half-century later, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis issued an apt apology. Meanwhile, Prohibition set rural fundamentalists at war with city slickers. Activist women, says historian Dan Okrent, aimed the booze ban at menfolk who drank their pay and beat them up. True to the law of unintended consequences, Prohibition actually made alcohol easier to get. The old saloons had banned most females and were shut Sundays. Now, speakeasies ran 24/7. With a secret knock and some ready cash, liberated women, dressed like flappers, could smoke cigarettes and drink like fish. The family car's back seat became ground zero for a post-Puritan sexual explosion. For many Bohemians, the tedious 20s were as dull and void as the era of good feelings and Gilded Age. Artistes like Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, Cole Porter, Zelda and F. Scott Fitzgerald took their movable feast to urbane Paris. But some went to Harlem. Genius band leaders like Duke Ellington and Count Basie played divine music. Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Bennett, James Weldon Johnson, Jesse Redmond Fawcett inspired a black renaissance that gave the Roaring Twenties its most brilliant art and letters. Amidst a white winter of material mindlessness, the, quote, new Negro, unquote, was alive and well, even if its best and brightest could not eat or lodge where they performed. Jazz's wild improvisations also spread through Edison's phonograph and Pittsburgh's KDKA, which in 1924 began broadcasting through parlor radios that changed everything. Telecommunications boomed in the 1920s. So did the Morgan, Edison, Tesla electric power business. Airliners linked the cities. Autos birthed a new suburban frontier. Like Grant before him, Harding's friends stole billions. Then, quote, the Duchess, unquote, our formidable First Lady, livid over Warren's sexual escapades, may or may not have poisoned him. She did, for certain, prevent an autopsy. A no longer so progressive middle class, it was time for another Winter's Gorge. A strong residual union movement protected wages. Millions bought, on margin, bogus stock certificates, while their bankers bet their unregulated, uninsured deposits at the Wall Street casino. The stock market boomed in tandem with the corporate rise of organized crime. Gambling, prostitution, protection, booze, drug, influence peddling, labor racketeering, murder for hire have always been integral to modern society. Starting in 1919, Arnold Rothstein put them on a corporate footing. New York's most infamous gambler, Rothstein heard that key players on the pennant-winning Chicago White Sox hated their skinflint owner, Charles Comiskey. So in 1919, after the regular season, Rothstein bribed the key players of the Chicago White Sox to throw the World Series to the underdog Cincinnati Reds. Quietly placing bets throughout the country, Arnold strong-armed Game 8's starting pitcher. The Black Sox lost that game 10-5 and the World Series. The infamous gambler then beat his prison sentence by buying a Chicago grand jury. Arnold Rothstein used his huge winnings to hire infamous upstarts like Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Ben Bugsy Siegel. After Arnold was shot in 1928, Luciano consolidated an increasingly corporate crime syndicate. In Chicago, the boisterous Al Capone built a booze-fueled empire and staged the infamous 1929 St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Arousing federal anger, Capone was imprisoned for tax evasion, did hard time in Alcatraz, and later died of syphilis. After World War II, Luciano dispatched Bugsy Siegel to run the Southern California mob. Becoming a Hollywood playboy, Benny turned a remote desert crossroads where gambling was legal into a mobster paradise. Siegel opened the first Las Vegas casino, the Flamingo, amidst a freak 1946 rainstorm. Then he took a bullet through the eye for skimming Lucky's cash. Vegas survived. So did the casinos Meyer Lansky financed in Havana until 1959, when Fidel Castro's revolution took them away. By then, organized crime had become synonymous with a deathly stream of cash, crime, and violence, whose affiliated corporations and warring families permeated the nation. 3 mob properties actually washed into the White House. Richard Nixon owed Meyer Lansky much of his early career. Nixon's mob connections flowed through his South Florida vacation home straight to colonized Cuba. Irish Boston's Joseph P. Kennedy cornered Scottish whiskey at Prohibition's end, then supported Hitler. According to Seymour Hersh and many others, the Kennedys vehemently deny this story. Joe paid for mob involvement in Chicago's 1960 presidential vote count. Ironically, had JFK lost Illinois, he still would have carried the Electoral College. In tandem with New York's 5 families, Fred Trump became an infamous KKK-loving slumlord. His son Donald seemed to see Atlantic City as another Las Vegas or Havana, but he sank the family empire deep into debt, then used it to launder rubles for Russian mobsters who helped him stumble into the presidency. With immeasurable money and muscle from street-corner drug pushers to labor racketeers, from judges on the bench to the mobster in the White House, the syndicates that Rothstein wrought still warp and shape our national organism. In the dollar diplomacy 1920s, as today, our imperial legions also ran wild. Nary a Latin American neighbor was left uninvaded. Imperial bases in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines made the Pacific our new backyard. But on August 27, 1928, the U.S., Germany, and France, joined eventually by another 59 nations, signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, pledging never to attack each other. In the fat winter of our third Gilded Age, humankind seemed ready at last to end all major wars. In early 1929, President Herbert Hoover, Iowa's Quaker-descended great engineer, proclaimed a permanent dawn of peace and prosperity. Like many of the era's best improvisations, our booming young adulthood ended on a high C. But like the war to end all wars, the coming cycle of our full adulthood hit an unimaginable global catastrophe.